While everyone is talking about popularity, hardship, and public anger, there is a harder question sitting quietly in the background. When exactly has popularity ever decided a Nigerian presidential election? That contradiction is uncomfortable because it forces us to separate how people feel from how power actually moves. Elections in Nigeria are not purely emotional events driven by public mood alone. They are structured outcomes shaped over time by systems, alliances, institutional behavior, and timing that most citizens never directly see. And that is where the real tension begins. Because if elections are not simply about who people like or dislike, then the conversation most Nigerians are having may already be missing the point. What if winning in 2027 has far less to do with approval ratings, public frustration, or online sentiment, and far more to do with controlling the deeper mechanics that operate beneath the surface? What if the visible election is only the final stage of a process that has already been influenced long before the first vote is cast? So the real question is not whether Nigerians are satisfied or dissatisfied. The real question is this: if the country is dissatisfied, how does an incumbent still win? Before we go further, if you're new here, Naija Update 24/7 exists for one reason: to give every Nigerian, wherever you are and whatever region you're from, the kind of political analysis that mainstream conversations often avoid. Hit subscribe and stay with me because this goes much deeper. To understand why this question even matters, you have to step into the current moment Nigeria is facing. The political atmosphere today is shaped by economic pressure that is visible in everyday life. Rising costs, inflation, and the ripple effects of major policy decisions have created a sense of strain across different parts of the country. Alongside that is a growing wave of public criticism, some measured, some emotional, but all pointing to a broader sense that expectations are not being met as quickly as many had hoped. But here is where it becomes more strategic than emotional. Conversations about 2027 are not starting now. They have already been quietly underway. Political actors rarely wait until election year to begin positioning. Alliances are tested early, relationships are built or repaired behind the scenes, calculations are made about which regions matter most, which political blocs can be persuaded, and which risks need to be managed before they become visible problems. This is not new. Nigerian political history shows a consistent pattern. Incumbency carries an advantage that goes beyond public perception. There have been elections where public sentiment suggested one direction, but the final outcome reflected something more complex, something shaped by organization, coordination, and timing rather than mood alone. That doesn't mean voters don't matter. It means voters are one part of a much larger system. And here is the first critical shift in perspective. In Nigeria, elections are rarely lost in February. They are shaped years before voters ever show up. By the time citizens are standing in line to vote, many of the decisive factors have already been influenced, negotiated, or locked into place. So if you want to understand how an incumbent could still win in a climate of dissatisfaction, you have to move your focus away from just the voters and begin looking directly at the system itself. At the center of that system are institutions, not in an abstract sense, but in very real, practical terms. The electoral body, for example, is responsible for organizing the process: registration, logistics, collation. Its structure, its efficiency, and its decision-making processes all shape how elections unfold on the ground. Alongside that is the judiciary, which becomes critical the moment disputes arise. Election tribunals do not just interpret outcomes, they can redefine them within the boundaries of the law. Then there are security agencies whose presence during elections is often framed around maintaining order, but their deployment, coordination, and enforcement also influence the environment in which voting takes place. Stability, access, and enforcement all sit within that space. Legally, the framework is clear on paper. Electoral laws define how votes are cast, counted, and declared. There are thresholds that must be met, requirements that must be satisfied. But where things become more complex is in interpretation and execution. Laws do not operate in a vacuum. They are applied by institutions, and that is where ambiguity can emerge. Disputes over results, questions about compliance, and the balance between strict enforcement and discretionary judgment all create gray areas. And beyond the legal layer, there are structural realities that cannot be ignored. Logistics determine where materials arrive on time and where they don't. Turnout patterns vary significantly across regions, often shaping outcomes more than overall national sentiment. State-level governance structures influence how mobilization happens, how voters are encouraged or discouraged from participating. This leads to a second critical insight. The system does not need to be broken to produce a predictable outcome. It only needs to be understood by those who know how to navigate it effectively. That understanding of timing, structure, and institutional behavior is often what separates political success from failure. But even that is not the full picture. Because institutions, while powerful, do not act in isolation. They interact with something even more decisive. And that is political strategy. At its core, incumbency provides advantages that are often underestimated in public discussions. One of them is control over timing, when policies are introduced, when narratives are emphasized, when attention is shifted. Another is access to a nationwide political network that has already been built over time, not assembled at the last minute. From there, coalition building becomes essential. Nigerian elections are rarely won by a single bloc. They require cross-regional alliances that reflect the country's diversity. Managing those alliances is not just about forming them, it's about maintaining internal unity, resolving conflicts quietly, and ensuring that key players remain aligned when it matters most.
On the other side of the equation is opposition fragmentation. When multiple strong candidates emerge without a unified front, votes are divided. And in that situation, dissatisfaction alone does not automatically translate into defeat for the incumbent. It simply spreads the opposition's strength across multiple directions. Behind all of this are silent stakeholders, political financiers who shape campaign capacity, regional power brokers who influence local outcomes, party structures at the grassroots level that determine how effectively support is mobilized on election day. These actors are rarely visible in public debates, but their impact is significant. And this brings us to a deeper layer of the strategy. Elections are not only about how many people vote. They are about where those votes come from, how they are distributed, and which areas become decisive. Strategic wins in key states can outweigh broader but less concentrated dissatisfaction. There is, however, one factor that quietly determines outcomes more than anything else, and it is not the presidency itself. If opposition votes are divided, dissatisfaction cannot on its own produce a political shift. It needs structure, coordination, and alignment to translate into victory. Now, if what I've just said challenges what you expected, pause for a moment and drop a comment below. I want to hear your perspective before we get to the part that changes everything. Because here's the missing piece. The factor that often decides elections long before the final count is announced is state-level political machinery. Governors, local political structures, and the systems that manage turnout at the grassroots level play a decisive role. They influence participation, shape local alliances, and determine how effectively votes are converted into actual results. And once you understand that, the conversation moves beyond individuals and into the structure of the country itself. The implications of that are national in scope. It means that federal elections are deeply connected to state-level dynamics. Governors become central figures not just within their states, but in shaping national outcomes. The balance between federal authority and state influence becomes more pronounced, especially during election cycles. Economically, continuity of leadership often signals stability to markets, even when public sentiment is mixed. At the same time, the possibility of change introduces uncertainty, which can affect investment decisions and broader economic confidence. For ordinary Nigerians, this translates into real-world consequences: prices, jobs, and the cost of living. Socially, the stakes are just as high. Public trust in electoral processes determines whether outcomes are accepted or contested. Perceptions of fairness across regions, across communities, shape national unity. When those perceptions are strained, tensions can rise in ways that go beyond politics. Security also becomes a critical factor. Elections must be conducted in an environment that is stable enough to allow participation, but also controlled enough to prevent disruption. The role of security agencies therefore sits at the intersection of protection and perception. And as important as all of this is within Nigeria, it does not exist in isolation, because external perception, how Nigeria is viewed globally, also feeds back into internal political realities. When you widen the lens beyond Nigeria's borders, another layer of reality begins to emerge, one that is rarely discussed openly, but quietly shapes how political outcomes are perceived and in some cases reinforced. On the global stage, most powerful governments are not primarily focused on who is popular within a country. Their priority is stability. Stability in governance, stability in economic policy, and stability in regional influence. Disruption, even when driven by legitimate public dissatisfaction, is often viewed cautiously because of the uncertainty it introduces. This is where strategic partnerships begin to matter. Nigeria occupies a critical position not just in West Africa, but across the continent in terms of economic weight, population, and geopolitical influence. That means external actors, particularly Western governments, tend to calibrate their responses carefully. Their diplomatic tone is often shaped less by internal public sentiment within Nigeria and more by whether the existing structure continues to provide predictability. It is not necessarily an endorsement of any individual leader, but rather a preference for continuity over volatility. At the same time, there's the Nigerian diaspora, millions of citizens living abroad, deeply engaged in national conversations, highly vocal on social media, and influential in shaping global narratives about Nigeria. Their voices matter in framing perception, in drawing attention to issues, and in influencing how Nigeria is discussed internationally. But when it comes to actual electoral outcomes, their role is indirect. They do not vote in large numbers within the system, but they do contribute significantly through remittances, which sustain households, and by extension, the broader economy. So their influence exists in a different dimension, economic and narrative, rather than procedural. When you connect this to a broader global pattern, the picture becomes even clearer. Across many emerging democracies, incumbents often retain an advantage not simply because of domestic factors, but because continuity tends to align more closely with external expectations. Stability frequently outweighs reform in the calculations of international stakeholders. And that doesn't mean reform is unimportant. It means reform is often expected to happen within an existing structure, not through sudden disruption. But not everyone agrees with this line of analysis, and that is exactly where the debate becomes necessary.
Because there's a strong and valid counter-argument that cannot be ignored. Public dissatisfaction, when it reaches a certain threshold, has the potential to disrupt even the most structured political systems. History, both within and outside Nigeria, has shown that when economic pressure, public frustration, and a sense of injustice align, they can produce outcomes that defy expectations. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it reshapes the political landscape in ways that systems alone cannot fully contain. There is also the question of youth participation. Nigeria has a large and increasingly engaged young population, more politically aware than previous generations, more connected through technology, and more willing to challenge established narratives. If that energy translates into coordinated participation, not just online but at the ballot box, it has the potential to alter traditional calculations. However, this is where misconceptions begin to distort the conversation.
One of the most common is the belief that popularity automatically translates into victory. It sounds logical, but it overlooks the structural realities that shape how votes are mobilized, counted, and distributed. Another misconception is the idea that social media reflects national consensus. In reality, it often represents the most vocal segments of the population, not necessarily the most decisive in electoral terms. So the truth sits somewhere in the middle. Sentiment matters, public mood matters, but structure matters just as much, sometimes more. Elections are not purely emotional events, and they are not purely mechanical either. They are a combination of both. A system designed to translate human choices into political outcomes, influenced at every stage by organization, coordination, and timing. And when you step back and look at it from a national perspective, the conversation becomes less about individuals and more about the country itself. For Nigeria as a whole, North, South, East, and West, the real issue is not simply who wins the next election. The deeper question is whether the system is capable of reflecting the will of the people while maintaining the stability that holds the country together. That balance is not easy to achieve, but it is essential. Looking ahead, the next phase is not about speculation, it is about observation. There are clear signals that will begin to define the direction of 2027 long before the campaign season officially begins. One of the most important is whether opposition groups move toward coalition or remain divided. Unity has historically been one of the few forces capable of countering incumbency advantage. Without it, even widespread dissatisfaction can become fragmented. At the same time, internal dynamics within political parties will matter just as much. Conflicts, alignments, and negotiations happening behind closed doors will shape who emerges as viable candidates and how cohesive those platforms are. These internal battles are often overlooked, but they can determine the strength or weakness of a party long before it faces the electorate. Then there's the question of state-level alignment. Governors, regional leaders, and local political structures will begin to position themselves, some openly, others quietly. Their decisions will influence not just voter mobilization, but the overall balance of power heading into the election. In terms of immediate actions, early endorsements will start to signal where influence is consolidating. Strategic appointments may be used to strengthen alliances or neutralize opposition. Policy positioning will also play a role, shaping public perception while simultaneously addressing or attempting to address key areas of dissatisfaction. As these elements come together, certain signals will indicate escalation, an increase in political messaging, more visible negotiations between regional blocs, and a shift from subtle positioning to more direct engagement. These are the moments when the quiet groundwork begins to move into the public space. But beyond 2027, there is a longer trajectory to consider. The strength of Nigeria's democratic institutions will either be reinforced or tested by how these processes unfold. Voter engagement, whether it increases or declines, will reflect public confidence in the system. And ultimately, the direction the country takes will depend not just on the outcome of one election, but on how that outcome is achieved. Which brings us back to the central question. Can an unpopular incumbent still win? The answer, based on everything we've examined, is yes. Not as a certainty, but as a possibility grounded in structure. If institutional alignment remains intact, if coalition building is effective, and if opposition forces remain fragmented, then dissatisfaction alone may not be enough to produce a different outcome. And that is the reality that is often difficult to confront, because it challenges the idea that elections are purely expressions of public will. Instead, it suggests that they are processes, complex, layered, and influenced by forces both visible and unseen. In the end, elections are not just about who Nigerians want, they are about how the system translates that desire into power. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one Nigerian who needs to understand what is really happening. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Niger Update 24/7. We never stop watching.